cable is dying. Hey guys, Nathan Dunn here at ZIMM'S Guitars, and I brought my 64 Princeton back in today. We're going to be switching out the can capacitor, the 3 filter caps that are in that. We already did the electrolytics on the board in the last video, so go check that out if you're interested. And then we might end up putting an old Jensen speaker in this thing to see how it sounds, and might do a little bit of tube rolling with some old RCA vintage tubes. So we'll see which ones sound the best, and let's get to it. Alright, so we have the chassis out of the cabinet, and the first thing that we're going to do, we generally skip over this kind of stuff in the videos. There's plenty of places that you can learn all about it, but I'm going to show you how to see if there's any voltage on your filter caps before you start putting your hands in the chassis. You want to make sure that everything is drained. So you're going to set your multimeter to read DC voltage. You can hook one lead up to the chassis, anywhere is really good, and then touch the other lead, and that one's at 0.076 volts. We're at 0 volts and 0.075 volts. But what you can do is you can get your, let's say that we did have a charge on that, you can get yourself a cable right here with some alligator clips on the end, and you want to make sure that you have a piece of rubber around the metal piece of the alligator clip, so that when you clip it on, you're not touching any metal. So what you want to do is just hook it up to the chassis, and then you can clip it right on there to each lead of the capacitor, and that'll ensure that it drains all the voltage out of the capacitors and that it's safe to touch. And you always want to do this after you've turned the amp on, used it, and pretty much any time before you're gonna be working inside your amp. You always want to verify that the capacitors are drained. So there you go. And if the capacitors have a high voltage on them, they're containing a lot of charge still, you might want to actually get a resistor, clip this onto the end of the resistor, and then touch the other lead to the capacitor. And the reason why is because if you have a really high voltage and you dead short it to the chassis, no resistor in between, then it's going to spark. It might damage some components, but what it's most likely going to do is just scare you. So you always want to make sure that you have that drained before you start touching stuff. And then another few areas that we could test on the chassis that might contain a voltage is on your other electrolytic caps. These generally don't store such a high charge, but you always want to verify before you start putting your hands inside the amp. And I haven't played this amp in probably a good week or so, maybe longer, so there's no charge on any of these, especially after I drained them. So then we're good to touch after that. Okay, so we got the new can capacitor in there, and here's the old one. You can see we got that old, this one's Astron, and it looks like it's dated 6402. So second week of 1964, which would align with this amp, and it should be running a lot stronger now. I was testing out the voltages, and everything seems to check out perfectly fine, and seems like it's good to go. One other thing that I did want to mention was that this is the 6G2 brown face Fender circuit, but since this is a transitional model, the volume pot in a lot of these is 250 kiloohms, so it's a 250K pot. So when you have the volume all the way down, if we measure the resistance from ground to the pin, right now I'm getting 260 kiloohms. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn my pot, measure. Yep, we're at 260 kilo ohms. Okay, so it's at about 0. So the thing is the brown Princetons, the 6G2s, before they started transitioning, these got 1 meg pots in the volume. If you have a 1 meg pot in here, it's actually going to dramatically change the headroom, the way that the amp breaks up. Right now this amp, it seems to be pretty tame all the way up until about 6 or 7, which can be good, especially if you're playing with humbuckers or P90s or something like that. But if you're playing with the Strat, you know, it can sound a little tame and I don't want to say weak, but once you get to 6 or 7, it really opens up. The volume increases, the gain goes up quite a bit, as you'd expect, and the amp just seems to become a little more alive. Well, if you replace it with the 1 meg pot, it's going to be more responsive earlier on in the volume on the control here, because the range that it's sweeping is a lot larger, so it kind of hits that spot early on in the volume. So this is something I may consider swapping out, putting in a 1 meg pot, but we'll have to save that for another day. We're going to put the amp together, and maybe we'll try swapping out the speaker and see how that sounds. We might have another Jensen that we might try and replace with, and check in for that. Alright, so we have the Princeton back out in the front of the shop. It right now has like a 65 Jensen speaker in it. We might change it out. It has a RCA 7025 in the first position and a GE 12AX7, and I believe that both of the power tubes are RCAs with an RCA GZ34 rectifier. So we're playing through a Jimmy Page Dragon Telly from 2019, I believe, and I'll just play some stuff. We'll go through the tremolo and see how the amp sounds.